Hello and welcome back to Bookish. And today I wanted to do a book review of The Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli. The Lost Children Archive is Luiselli's first book, or novel I should say, written in English. Her previous novels were published in Spanish. My camera's a little crooked there. Her previous novels were published in Spanish and then translated. She's also the author of an essay called Tell Me How This Ends, an essay in 40 questions, which involves the same essential topic as the novel The Lost Children Archive, and that topic is the plight of refugee children along the U.S.-Mexico border. This novel was nominated and I believe shortlisted for the Booker Prize this year, and I've seen mixed reviews here on BookTube, and I know a lot of people have thought about reading it and have been somewhat reluctant based on what they've heard about the novel. So on the surface, the novel tells the story of a family road trip to the Apacheria, an area in Arizona along the U.S.-Mexico border. There's a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter. Typical kind of family car trip, and they're traveling from New York City all the way down to the border. And at the end of this trip, it becomes clear that the mother and father will separate and take their children, because both those kids are from previous marriages or relationships, and take their own children with them. And not only will the husband and wife split up, but so will the children. I think Luiselli uses this kind of most typical American thing, the in the car vacation, with all the things that we know go along with that if you've ever taken one, which is the fighting of the kids in the back seat, the fighting of the parents in the front seat, sketchy motels, strange diners, oftentimes kind of the side of America that seems the most garish and the most outlandish and oftentimes the most stereotypical is what you see. And she's going to use this most typical of American family activities, I think, to contrast with what I think is kind of the political message of the Lost Children Archive, and that is the also equally typical habit of cruelty through neglect practiced by the United States, whether it's against the children who are refugees and being stuck in what we call camps, or really prisons along the borders, or the treatment of Native Americans in the past. That all of these things are, I think, supposed to kind of firmly ground the novel in the American experience, both kind of benign with the family car trip and devastating with the treatment of both Native Americans and child refugees along the border. So this kind of idea that Luiselli is wrapping her novel and the action of her novel around is represented, this idea of cruelty through neglect is represented by the father, in this case, who is obsessed with the Apache Indians and Chief Cochise and Geronimo and what happened to them in the area in which they lived, and the mother, who is increasingly obsessed because of her work with refugee children and trying to get those kids united with their parents, which is a real life experience Luiselli's had, and her obsession with the refugee kids. Both father and mother record sounds. The father has I think the father records what I would just call atmospheric sounds, the sound of the wind, the sound of echoes, the sounds of traffic, and the mother records conversations. She records narratives, and they're both essentially plan to go to this area, the Apacheria in Arizona along the U.S.-Mexico border, to make these recordings. The husband to record the sounds of the areas from which the Apache used to live, and the mother to record the narratives of children or parents or the parents of these children who attempted to cross the border. During the trip, the kids absorb all of these threads. They absorb information about the Apache Indians. They absorb the stories of the lost children and the refugee kids and the plight of those kids. At the same time, the mother puts on an audiobook in the car, and that audiobook is Lord of the Flies, which is essentially, a story about lost children. And this kind of I guess, atmosphere in which the kids travel sinks into at least the boys' consciousness, and it gets all mixed up and blended together in a way which will then kind of determine the action that takes place later in the novel. If you do choose to read the Lost Children Archive, you need to kind of, I think, one of the joys I got from it was paying attention to the kind of repeated thematic elements that are in it. There's the theme of abandoned children, children being abandoned by their parents. There's the theme of people being relocated against their will. There's a theme, of course, of children being separated from their parents. There's the theme of trains and how often trains and train cars play a role in the story, past, present, future. There's the theme of sounds and kind of the recordings of people and the sounds as almost like recording ghostly remnants of those people, those civilizations. There are there are themes that I think that also explains the kind of obsession, particularly near the end of the book, with echoes, and there's stuff about maps and archive boxes, and it is an incredibly ambitious novel which attempts to blend a whole lot of things together, I think, to create a mood, to create an emotional response to what's going on in all kinds of ways. So the story of the trip itself, from New York essentially down to where they're going along the border, is told from the mother's point of view, and her relationship to the kids and her increasingly strained relationship with the father. After they get there, then the narrative or the story is picked up and told from the point of view of the 10-year-old son, who is going to kind of drive the action at the end of the book by a decision he makes that involves his younger sister and these kind of ideas that have been implanted in his head almost subconsciously during the trip about the Apaches, about the lost children, about maps and trains and echoes and Native American names, and all these kind of things have just kind of been absorbed in this kid, and he takes an action based on that, which I won't give away. But this is the part of the story, I think, where a lot of people have found fault with the novel, and I'll talk more about one of my problems I have with this a little bit later on. But this is where I think the novel becomes the most interesting, and I think if you're reading carefully with an open mind, you begin to see how Louis Elly intends to blend the story of what's happening to these kids, obviously, with what's happening to kids crossing the border, to, all kind of bring it together in what I can only describe as almost kind of a surreal scene near the end of the book. And no matter how improbable that all seems, within the framework of what Louis Elly's tried to create, I think it makes sense. So a couple of things about the novel that I think are interesting from an experimental fiction point of view. The novel itself is set up like an archive. You get a list and set up like archive boxes, which, by the way, is another theme that shows up in the novel, because the family travels with, I think, 7 archive boxes in the trunk of their car, and that kind of archive box plays a role. The chapters are set up like archives, labeled as box 1 and so on. You get a list from time to time of the actual items that are in the box, and it's just a list. And the items in that box may have been things that came up in the previous chapter. They may be things that come up in the chapter that follows, but there's kind of a non-narrative narrative going on there with the items that are located in the box themselves. There is actual data from the United States Border Patrol and the information it collects about the bodies of deceased children that it finds in the desert, which is incredibly powerful. There are photographs. There are photographs that are taken by the son, which are described in the book, and then you find at the end of the novel that they're actually there. Polaroids taken on one of those old Polaroid instant cameras, and it's just incredibly inventive, and I think it works. I'm just going to tell you up front that I like the novel. I'm not sure it's my favorite book of the year, but I liked it a lot, and I thought all that kind of worked. And I asked a question in my video, Saturday Hodgepodge video, about whether or not people liked experimental fiction. If this counts as experimental fiction, then this would be an example of experimental fiction that I think works. Having said that, I do think there are 2 issues I want to bring up. One is really just kind of echoing an issue that others have mentioned, and that is, I think, that when we get to that, when we get to the section about which is told from the point of view of the son, I'm not sure all those ideas, thoughts, are things that are reality for a 10-year-old boy. And the other issue I have is just with Luiselli's writing. For the most part, I think it's good, but occasionally I think she overwrites, and she continues on with a metaphor or analogy or an idea longer than she has to. And so here's my example of that. Unhappiness grows slowly. It lingers inside you silently, surreptitiously. You nourish it, feeding it scraps of yourself every day. It is the dog kept locked away in the back patio that will bite your hand off if you let it. Unhappiness takes time, but eventually it takes over completely. For me, there's too much in that. She's, I think, created a fairly effective metaphor, analogy, whatever it is, for unhappiness. That it lingers, that it's silent, that it's secretive, that you nourish it, that you feed it scraps of yourself every day. And I think she could have stopped right there. So to me, and she does this several times in the book, but this is just, maybe it's just me. To me, when she goes on to say, it is the dog kept locked away in the back patio that will bite your hand off if you let it, that just feels like it's too much. She's created what I think is a fairly effective and fairly beautiful description of unhappiness, and then added this image of a biting dog, which feels a little cliched. Anyway, and then I think if she just left that part out, if she'd just gone on to unhappiness takes time, but eventually it takes over completely, I think that would have been fine. And there are passages, particularly in the mother section, where that happens. But having said all that, I think this is a very good book. And you know, if you have a taste occasionally for experimental fiction and you are curious about the Lost Children Archive, I would encourage you to read it. It reads fairly quickly. I think the writing is good. I think the story is interesting. I know a lot of people don't like stories told from a child's perspective, but that is the minority of the book. And I think it's well done. And I think it's effective. So anyway, there you go. That's my review of The Lost Children Archive by Valeria Luiselli. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.